The land of Israel trembled under the iron grip of the Philistines. Darkness spread across the nation, not just from foreign rule, but from the rebellion in the hearts of its people. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21 verse 25. Could a land so steeped in chaos and sin be redeemed? The answer lay hidden, waiting in the most unexpected place. A man born with a divine purpose, but haunted by human frailty. Samson's birth was more than a miracle. It was a declaration. An angel appeared to his barren mother, proclaiming that her son would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Judges 13:5. But was Samson's destiny already tainted by the flaws of man? What happens when divine power is entrusted to someone consumed by their own desires? From the moment of his first breath, a war began. One not just against the Philistines, but within Samson himself. What is strength? Is it the power to defeat enemies, or the ability to conquer one's own demons? Samson's life was marked by supernatural feats, yet beneath the surface, the cracks in his character grew wider with each victory. He tore a lion apart with his bare hands, Judges 14:5-6, but could he tear down the pride that consumed his soul? Was Samson, chosen from birth, doomed to fail before he even began? As the Philistines grew stronger, so did Samson's reputation as Israel's judge. His victories over the enemy were legendary, but his failures whispered of something darker. How could a man so strong be so easily led astray? Could his impulsive nature be a weapon forged against him? Every triumph seemed to come at a cost, and with each act of vengeance the question deepened. Was Samson delivering Israel or destroying himself? Samson's greatest flaw was not physical, but spiritual. The power that flowed through him was from God, yet he wielded it with reckless abandon. He was consecrated under a Nazirite vow, but he treated it as though it were a weapon of his own making. How long could he defy the very God who gave him strength before it consumed him? His strength became a double-edged sword, cutting both the Philistines and his own soul. Then there was Delilah. The name itself carried with it the weight of Samson's downfall. Was it love, lust, or something deeper that drove him into her arms? She was a woman of the enemy, and yet Samson, blinded by his desires, ignored the warning signs. Could anyone be so powerful and so blind at the same time? Delilah's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a turning point in a story already teetering on the edge of disaster. As Samson revealed the secret of his strength, he sealed his fate. His hair, the outward symbol of his covenant with God, was gone, and with it, his power. But was his downfall truly because of the loss of his hair, or was it the inevitable result of a life lived in defiance of his calling? The Philistines didn't just capture a man, they captured Israel's last hope, or so they thought. Dragged in chains, blinded and broken, Samson was led to Gaza, where his enemies celebrated their victory over the God of Israel. But could they truly understand what was happening? Samson's story was far from over. There, in the darkness, bound by chains, a flicker of something greater stirred within him. Could it be that in losing everything, Samson would find what he had always needed, dependence on God? His hair began to grow again, Judges 16:22. A seemingly insignificant detail, but to Samson, it meant everything. Could the God he had forsaken still have a plan for him? The answer to that question would be written in the crumbling stone of a Philistine temple, as Samson prepared for his final act of defiance, not against the Philistines, but against the man he had allowed himself to become. Samson's journey was one of extremes. His victories were colossal. He single-handedly slaughtered 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey, Judges 15 verse 15, leaving a trail of enemies broken at his feet. But his heart was a battlefield of its own, where pride and impulse warred against his divine calling. Could a man chosen by God lose sight of his purpose so easily? Samson seemed invincible, yet with each victory the enemy within him grew stronger. The Philistines feared him, and rightly so. He was their worst nightmare, a weapon of divine destruction. But could they sense the flaw in his armor? His strength was unmatched, but his heart was vulnerable. Delilah saw it. She played him like a harp, coaxing from him the secret of his power. How could Samson, who had defeated entire armies, be undone by a single woman? The answer lay in the twisted labyrinth of his desires, desires he could never seem to control. Samson's passion for Philistine women was not just a personal failing. It was a betrayal of his mission. How could he sleep with the enemy, both literally and figuratively? His lust for Delilah was a symptom of a deeper sickness, one that would ultimately cost him everything. But could anyone see the end coming? Could Samson? Or was he so blinded by his own pride that he didn't realize the trap he was walking into? When Delilah cut his hair, the symbolic severing of his covenant with God, Samson's world came crashing down. He woke to find himself weak, his strength gone, his enemies upon him. Judges 16:19. The man who had once torn lions apart with his hands was now bound and helpless. Could there be a greater fall from grace? The Philistines gouged out his eyes, taking from him the very thing he had already lost, his ability to see. But what did Samson see now, in the darkness? Chained and blind, Samson became a tool for his enemies, grinding grain like a beast of burden in Gaza's prison. How long did he have to reflect on his choices? The God who had once empowered him now seemed distant. But could God ever truly abandon his chosen? Samson's hair began to grow again, unnoticed by the Philistines. Was this a sign of hope? Could there still be a chance for redemption, even after such catastrophic failure? The Philistines celebrated their victory, certain that they had defeated both Samson and the God of Israel. But victory is never as simple as it seems. Could they have known that the man they paraded through the streets was not yet finished? Samson, broken as he was, had one final act left in him. In the depths of his despair, he began to pray. Could God still use him? His strength had always come from God, not from his hair, and now, in his blindness, Samson saw that clearly. The crowd gathered in the temple of Dagon, eager to mock their once great enemy. But as they reveled in their victory, did they realize the trap they had set for themselves? Samson stood between the pillars of the temple, his hands resting on the stone that would soon collapse upon them all. His prayer was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of regret. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Judges 16:28. Could one final act of faith turn the tide? The temple began to tremble. The crowd, so confident in their triumph, suddenly realized that the tables had turned. Samson pushed with all the strength God had restored to him, and the pillars cracked under the force. In that moment, the fate of Israel's enemies was sealed. Could Samson's death accomplish what his life could not? As the temple collapsed, the Philistine lords were buried beneath the rubble, their laughter silenced in an instant. In the end, Samson killed more of Israel's enemies in his death than he had in his entire life. Judges 16, verse 30. But was this truly a victory? Samson had died, and with him, the last hope of Israel's deliverance. Or was it? Could Samson's greatest victory have come, not through his strength, but through his surrender? In the rubble of the temple, one thing became clear. God's plans are never thwarted, even by the flaws of the men he chooses. Samson's journey had ended, but the echoes of his life would resonate through history. Was his story one of failure or redemption? Perhaps both. What mattered most was not how he had fallen, but how he had risen again in the final moments of his life. Could it be that in death, Samson had found the peace he had always longed for? The peace that only comes from surrendering to a power greater than his own. Samson's captivity was more than a physical imprisonment. It was the final stage of a spiritual battle that had raged within him his entire life. Blinded and bound, he was led to the temple of Dagon, where the Philistines gathered to celebrate their victory over Israel's God. But was this truly a victory, or had they walked into a trap of their own making? Samson's humiliation was complete, yet within him, something stirred. Could it be that in losing everything, he was finally finding what he needed? The Philistines jeered and laughed, certain that their god Dagon had triumphed over the God of Israel. Samson stood before them, a broken man, blind and powerless. But was he powerless? His hair had begun to grow again, a sign that his connection to God was being restored. Could the Philistines have realized the significance of this? They saw only a defeated enemy, but Samson knew that something far greater was about to happen. In the darkness of his blindness, Samson's thoughts must have turned inward. How had it come to this? How had a man chosen by God, gifted with supernatural strength, fallen so far? Could it be that his greatest enemy had never been the Philistines, but himself? As he stood in the temple of Dagon, surrounded by his enemies, Samson faced the ultimate question. Could God still use him, even after all he had done? The Philistines had made one critical error. They had underestimated the power of repentance. Samson, broken and humiliated, reached out to God in his final hour. His prayer was not for revenge, but for redemption. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more. Judges 16:28. Could one final act of faith erase a lifetime of failure? As Samson placed his hands on the pillars of the temple, he knew that the answer would come not from his own strength, but from God. The temple was filled with more than 3,000 Philistines, all eager to witness the final humiliation of their enemy. But as Samson's hands tightened around the pillars, the air in the temple seemed to change. Could anyone have predicted what was about to happen? The crowd, still drunk on their victory, was oblivious to the tremors beneath their feet. Samson, blinded by his own mistakes, had now found clarity in his faith. Could this be the moment that changed everything? Samson's muscles tensed, but it was not his own power that surged through him. It was the strength of God, restored to him in his final act of surrender. The pillars cracked under the force, and temple began to collapse. The Philistines, so certain of their triumph, now realized too late that they had been defeated. Could a man so broken achieve such a devastating victory? The answer lay in the rubble of the temple, where thousands of Israel's enemies were buried. The temple collapsed with a thunderous roar, crushing the Philistine rulers beneath it. In his death, Samson had killed more of Israel's enemies than in his entire life. Judges 16, verse 30. But was this truly a victory? Samson had died, but his death had accomplished what his life could not, the crippling of the Philistine leadership. Could it be that Samson's greatest act of strength was not in his physical power, but in his surrender to God's will? As the dust settled, the magnitude of what had just happened became clear. Samson's death was not the end, it was the beginning of Israel's deliverance. The Philistines who had mocked him were now buried beneath the ruins of their own arrogance. Could this be the ultimate irony? That in death, Samson had found the victory he had always sought? The question lingered, unanswered, as the ruins of the temple lay in silence. Samson's humiliation had been transformed into redemption, not through his own power, but through his faith in God. Could this be the message of his life? That even the most broken of individuals can be used by God to accomplish his purposes. In the end, Samson's story was not one of failure, but of redemption. His strength had been his downfall, but it had also been his salvation. Could there be a greater paradox? The story of Samson's death echoes through history as a reminder that God's plans are never thwarted, even by the flaws of the men he chooses. Could it be that Samson's greatest victory was not over the Philistines, but over himself? In the end, Samson had found the peace he had always longed for, the peace that comes from surrendering to a power greater than his own. His death was not a defeat, it was a triumph of faith. The temple of Dagon was packed with Philistine nobles, warriors, and rulers. They had gathered for one purpose, to celebrate the defeat of Samson, Israel's great judge. But could they have foreseen that their victory was about to turn to dust? Samson, blind and broken, stood between the pillars that held the weight of the temple. His hands rested on the cold stone, his mind focused not on revenge, but on something far greater. Could one final act of faith change everything? The Philistines had no idea what was coming. They mocked Samson, jeering at the man who had once brought them to their knees. But Samson's heart was no longer consumed by pride or anger. He had finally realized that his strength had never come from himself. Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please God, strengthen me just once more. Judges 16:28. Could this be the moment when God's power would once again flow through him? The tension in the air was thick, though the crowd remained oblivious. Samson's hands tightened around the pillars, and the temple seemed to shudder beneath him. Could the Philistines sense it? Could they feel the weight of their own arrogance pressing down upon them? The pillars, once so strong, began to crack under the pressure. Samson pushed with all the strength God had given him, and in that moment, the temple's fate was sealed. Could one man, in a single act of faith, bring down an entire empire? The temple collapsed in a roar of stone and dust, burying thousands of Philistines beneath it. Their laughter turned to screams as the ground gave way beneath them. In his death, Samson had accomplished what his life had not. He had crippled the Philistine leadership, striking a blow that would resonate through history. Could it be that Samson's greatest victory had come not through his strength, but through his surrender to God's will? The Philistines lay buried beneath the rubble, victims of their own hubris. As the dust settled, the enormity of what had just happened became clear. More than 3,000 Philistines, including their rulers and nobles, had died in the collapse. Judges 16:30. Samson had killed more of Israel's enemies in his death than in his entire life. But was this truly a victory? Samson's story was one of redemption, not revenge. Could his death have been the culmination of everything God had planned for him? The question lingered as the temple lay in ruins. Samson's final act of faith was not one of vengeance, but of obedience. Could it be that his greatest strength was not in his physical power, but in his willingness to submit to God's will? His death was not a defeat, it was a fulfillment of the purpose for which he had been born. In the rubble of the Philistine temple, one thing was clear: God's plan had always been greater than Samson's failures. Could this be the message of his life? The Philistines, so confident in their triumph, had been brought low by the very man they had mocked. But was this victory Samson's, or was it God's? Could anyone have predicted that a man so broken, so flawed, would achieve such a devastating victory? In the end, Samson had found redemption not through his strength, but through his surrender. The temple's collapse was more than just the end of an era. It was the beginning of something far greater. Samson's death was a reminder that God's plans are never thwarted, even by the flaws of the men he chooses. Could it be that Samson's story points to a greater truth? That sometimes the greatest victories come not through power, but through sacrifice? His life had been marked by impulsiveness and pride, but in his final moments, he had found peace in surrendering to God. Could this be the message we are meant to take from his story? As Israel heard the news of Samson's death, they must have wondered, what now? Their judge was dead, but his death had dealt a crippling blow to their enemies. Could this be the beginning of their deliverance? Samson's story was far from over. In the rubble of the Philistine temple, a new chapter in Israel's history was beginning. Could they learn from Samson's life and turn back to the God who had never abandoned them? In the end, Samson's greatest victory was not over the Philistines, but over himself. He had found peace not in his strength, but in his surrender to God's will. Could this be the lesson for all of us? That true strength is found not in our own power, but in our willingness to trust in God. Samson's story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, redemption is always within reach. Could this be the true victory? The victory of faith over pride. As the dust settled over the ruins of the Philistine temple, the magnitude of Samson's final act became clear. The once mighty structure lay in pieces, and with it, the lives of more than 3,000 Philistines, including their rulers and nobles, were snuffed out in an instant. Judges 16:30. Could anyone have imagined that Samson, blinded and broken, would achieve such a devastating victory? In his death, Samson had accomplished what he could not in life, the crippling of Israel's enemies. But was this victory his, or was it God's? The news of Samson's death must have spread like wildfire through Israel. Their judge, who had once been their greatest hope, had died in a foreign land, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies. But could this be seen as a victory? Samson had delivered a crushing blow to the Philistines, but at the cost of his own life. Was this the price of deliverance? Could Israel, still reeling from years of oppression, find hope in the death of their flawed but powerful leader? Samson's final act was not just a moment of personal sacrifice, it was the fulfillment of God's plan. From the beginning, Samson's life had been destined for this moment. His strength, his weaknesses, his victories, and his failures had all led to this one climactic event. Could it be that God's purposes are fulfilled even in the midst of our greatest failures? Samson's story is a reminder that no matter how far we fall, God's plan is never derailed. Could this be the ultimate message of his life? But what does it mean to win through death? Samson's life had been marked by impulsive decisions and personal failings, yet in his final moment, he had achieved his greatest victory. Could this paradox reflect a deeper truth? That sometimes, the greatest victories come not through power, but through sacrifice? Samson's death points to a reality that transcends his own story, one where victory is found not in the preservation of life, but in the willingness to lay it down for a greater purpose. In many ways, Samson's story foreshadows the ultimate sacrifice that would come centuries later. Like Samson, another would come who would lay down his life to achieve a victory that could not be won in any other way. Could it be that Samson's death is a shadow of the death of Christ, who in his moment of greatest weakness brought about the greatest victory of all? Samson's story reminds us that God's ways are not our ways, and that true strength is often found in surrender. As Israel reflected on the life and death of Samson, they must have wondered, was this the end of their struggle, or just the beginning? Samson had delivered a devastating blow to the Philistines, but their oppression was far from over. Could his death inspire a renewed faith in the God who had called them? Samson's story was a reminder that even the most flawed individuals can be used by God to accomplish his purposes. Could Israel learn from Samson's life and turn back to the God who had never abandoned them? Samson's legacy is one of both triumph and tragedy. He had been chosen by God, gifted with supernatural strength, and called to deliver Israel. Yet his life had been marked by personal failings and impulsive decisions. Could it be that Samson's greatest victory was not in his physical strength, but in his final act of faith? His death was not a defeat, but a fulfillment of the purpose for which he had been born. Could this be the true message of his life, that God's plan is always greater than our failures? In the end, Samson's story is a testament to the power of God's grace. Despite his many mistakes, God never abandoned him. Even in his final moments, Samson was able to fulfill his calling, not because of his own strength, but because of God's mercy. Could this be a reminder that no one is beyond redemption? That no matter how far we fall, God's grace is always within reach? Samson's story is not one of failure, but of redemption. A reminder that God's purposes are always greater than our shortcomings. As we reflect on Samson's life, we are reminded of the mystery of God's sovereignty. Samson's journey was filled with twists and turns, moments of triumph and failure, yet in the end, God's plan was fulfilled. Could it be that God uses even our failures to accomplish his purposes? Samson's life teaches us that no mistake, no act of rebellion can thwart the plans of God. His story is a powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, God is working to bring about his ultimate victory. Samson's death was not the end of his story, but the fulfillment of his purpose. His life, marked by strength and weakness, victory and failure, points to a deeper truth, that God's purposes are always greater than our own. Could this be the ultimate message of Samson's life? That true strength is found not in our own power, but in our willingness to surrender to God's will. Samson's story reminds us that no matter how far we fall, redemption is always possible, and that God's victory is never out of reach. Samson's life is a powerful reminder of the paradox of strength and weakness. His supernatural power was a gift from God, yet his greatest victory came not through his physical strength, but through his surrender to God's will. Could it be that our greatest triumphs come not from our own abilities, but from our willingness to trust in God? Samson's story invites us to reflect on the nature of strength, physical, spiritual, and emotional, and to consider what it means to live a life of faith. One of the most profound lessons from Samson's life is the power of God's grace. Despite his many failures, God never abandoned him. Even after Samson had betrayed his Nazirite vow and fallen into the hands of his enemies, God's grace was still at work in his life. Could this be a reminder that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is always available to us? Samson's story is a testament to the fact that redemption is always possible, even in our darkest moments. Samson's life also teaches us about the cost of disobedience. His strength was meant to be used for God's purposes, yet time and again, Samson used it for his own personal gain. Could it be that his greatest failing was not his physical weakness, but his spiritual disobedience? His story challenges us to consider how we are using the gifts God has given us. Are we living in alignment with God's will, or are we pursuing our own desires? The consequences of our choices are real, and Samson's life is a sobering reminder of that truth. Another key lesson from Samson's life is the nature of true leadership. Samson was called to be a judge over Israel, yet his leadership was marred by impulsive decisions and personal failings. Could it be that true leadership is not about physical power, but about humility and obedience? Samson's story challenges us to reflect on the kind of leaders we are called to be. Are we willing to submit to God's authority, or are we trying to lead on our own terms? The story of Samson reminds us that God calls flawed individuals, but it is our willingness to follow him that defines our success. Samson's death carries a profound message about the nature of sacrifice. In his final act, he willingly laid down his life to fulfill God's plan. Could this be a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice, the death of Christ on the cross? Like Samson, Jesus achieved his greatest victory in his moment of greatest weakness. Both stories remind us that true strength is found not in preserving our lives, but in laying them down for a greater purpose. Could it be that Samson's story points us toward the ultimate sacrifice that brings redemption to all? The story of Samson also challenges us to reflect on the nature of redemption. Despite his many failings, Samson was ultimately redeemed through his final act of faith. Could this be a reminder that no one is beyond the reach of God's grace? Samson's story teaches us that redemption is not about living a perfect life, but about turning back to God, even after we have fallen. Could it be that Samson's greatest victory was not over the Philistines, but over his own pride and disobedience? Samson's life is also a reminder of the mystery of God's sovereignty. Despite his impulsive decisions and personal failings, God's plan was never derailed. Could this be a reminder that God's purposes are always greater than our mistakes? Samson's story invites us to reflect on the fact that God can use even our failures to accomplish his will. No matter how far we stray, God's plan is never beyond reach. Could it be that Samson's life is a testament to the fact that God's grace is greater than our shortcomings? The story of Samson challenges us to reflect on the nature of true strength. Is it found in physical power, or in the willingness to surrender to God's will? Samson's greatest victory came not through his physical strength, but through his faith in God. Could this be a reminder that true strength is found in our dependence on God, rather than in our own abilities? Samson's story invites us to consider where we are placing our trust. Are we relying on our own strength, or are we trusting in God's power? As we reflect on Samson's life, we are reminded of the importance of faith. Despite his many failings, Samson's final act was one of profound faith. Could this be a reminder that faith is not about living a perfect life, but about trusting in God's plan, even in our moments of greatest weakness? Samson's story challenges us to consider where we are placing our faith. Are we trusting in ourselves, or are we trusting in God? The story of Samson reminds us that faith is the foundation of true strength. Samson's life is a powerful reminder of the nature of strength, faith, and redemption. His story teaches us that no matter how far we fall, God's grace is always available to us. Could it be that Samson's greatest victory was not over the Philistines, but over his own pride and disobedience? His life invites us to reflect on the nature of true strength, not in our own abilities, but in our dependence on God. Samson's story reminds us that redemption is always possible, and that God's plan is always greater than our failures.